Hello and welcome to World Talks here on TVP World. I'm your host Benjamin Lee, and please join me and my guests on this next interview. Weekend talks between the United States and Ukraine suggest cautious progress on security guarantees and humanitarian issues, even as the war escalates with Ukrainian strikes deep into Russian energy infrastructure. At the same time, analysts warn the conflict is reshaping how wars are fought globally, with implications reaching beyond Europe. Joining us today on TVP World to connect these developments is Hanna Shelest, Director of Security Programs at Ukrainian PRISM. Hello and welcome to TVP World.
Hello.
So first, let's take a look at the weekend's talk in the United States. How close are we realistically to any kind of breakthrough when it comes to negotiations?
First of all, we need to understand that we have de facto two tracks of negotiations. One is Ukraine-U.S., and they are predominantly about the security guarantees or about any possibility for the deterrence of the possible future Russian aggression. And the second bulk of negotiations, that's everything what is connected with the possible ceasefire or the end of the war, where we have trilateral format or sometimes bilateral Russia, Ukraine, the United States. And here we are on the different tracks. If with the United States, more or less, we managed to negotiate the parameters of the future security guarantees. So with the Russian Federation, the situation is much more difficult. We saw that originally in Dubai, we had some progress. And then at the next stage in Geneva, we are just like back roll because, again, Mr. Medinsky was the head of the negotiating team. And definitely with the events happening for the last 3 weeks in the Middle East and the Gulf, we see how everything is on pause. So it would be very difficult to say with which moods all sides would return back to the negotiation table.
Right, like you mentioned, there's like two separate boxes here. When we talk about negotiations, having some sort of conclusion, of course, a lot of people's mind go directly to the ceasefire. But here we're actually talking about more about the security guarantees for Ukraine. It does seem like there is some progress according to the officials. But what does that actually mean in this context? Are we talking about real conversions coming to some sort of agreement, or are we just talking about perhaps the differences being a bit more narrow?
No, what we had the last time, we are not speaking about the negotiations that are happening these days in Miami, because they are more about how to return back to that second track with the Russian Federation. But previously, all the negotiations bilateral that we had, they were about very particular things. Like, what if Russia again attack after the ceasefire? What the United States would do? Will they send boots on the ground or more weapons, or even the military negotiated like 48 hours activities, 72 hours activities. So what we heard from the negotiation team, that military teams, security teams really managed to set a certain, not only parameters, but I would say the exact steps for the first days and first hours of the possible aggression. So in this case, I would say that it is a huge step forward compared to what we had even 6 months ago, when the United States didn't want to speak about any type of the security guarantees.
Right, definitely. It sounds like a lot of progress was actually made there. Do you think this also could be a sign to show that the U.S. has shifted its approach when it comes to negotiating with Ukraine? Or do you think this is going to continue in how Washington handle its negotiations?
We definitely see that the United States would like to see themselves less as the security guarantor, but more as the mediator. What would be very difficult to do in this case, because Russian Federation doesn't want to negotiate. They would like to feel a certain deterrence and that Ukraine is protected. So in this way, if the United States really would like to be an efficient mediator, they need to back Ukraine with the concrete promises, especially when they are blocking Ukrainian NATO membership. But what really helped, I think, that we see a great involvement of the European nations. When European nations started to speak about possible boots on the ground, not to fight, but to be those who are observing the ceasefire, monitoring the ceasefire, who is providing the help on the ground. In this case, it was easier for the United States to go to the next step when we are speaking about intelligence, satellite reconnaissance, because without this, it's difficult to monitor the ceasefire, and to speak about the possible military support in terms of weapons, because that presents not the unilateral actions of the United States, but a complex of activities that are possible for the future.
Right, so the dots are actually starting to connect together. We can see that there's actually interest in if Washington were to try and mediate this, they actually do have to get involved when it comes to security guarantees as well. Now, I'm also interested in the recent strikes and attack on infrastructure like Primorsk. We do know that this is where a lot of the Russia's shadow fleet has been getting their oil from. How significant is actually the Ukraine targeting this deep inside Russia, striking this facility?
Not only this facility, but in general, when Ukraine strikes such facilities, it is very important because oil is the main income for the Russian economy. And as we know, 20%, officially only 20% of the Russian budget is spent for this war and for military and security activities. Unofficially, the numbers that we heard from the experts are up to 30%. So any type of the possibility to cut this income is very important. Plus, don't forget that the armed forces needs all of this. So we are also really influencing logistics of the Russian army. But the latest strike is very important also because of the distance. As previously, Russia thought that Ukraine can attack only the neighboring bordering regions, and they felt very safe. So when Ukraine started to shoot as far as Leningrad Oblast, and that is really far, that's also the understanding that the Russian Federation is not safe. So they are losing that benefit that they had when they've been striking the western regions of Ukraine, for example, demonstrating their power.
Right, so there's also not just kind of a practical strike, but also has an element of demonstrating Ukraine's capability as well. Now, something I'm quite curious about, though, is we do know that Trump recently lifted some sanctions on Russian oil, no doubt trying to stabilize global oil market. But at the same time, Ukraine did strike Russia's energy infrastructure and these port and oil facilities as well, which is, of course, going to diminish Russia's capability to do exactly that. Do you think that this is going to come into a conflict of interest with the United States, and how do you think Washington administration might react to that?
As far as we heard from those lifting, they were predominantly for those oil that is already on ships. So in this case, we are not jeopardizing the supply because it's already been for quite a significant amount. Let's not forget that as soon as that was just the beginning of the war, Russians started immediately to put a lot of the energy resources to their ships, starting to deliver it to India and to few other countries, to China in particularly. So in this case, the lifting is just for those that are already on board of ships. And what will be next? Let's see. Just today we heard that the United States also allowed selling of the Iranian oil. That's also quite a paradoxical during the war.
Right. Speaking of paradoxical, we do know that Russia does fill its war coffer mostly through the sale of these energy products. Do you think that, well, by lifting this sanction, the Washington administration might actually be damaging Ukraine in the form of helping Russia refill their war coffer?
I would say that it's damaging not only Ukraine, but in general, the regime of sanctions and how we believe in it, because this decision is very short term. First of all, that is quite strange that it was not calculated before the beginning of the war, and we didn't have any de-risking in this case, because it was really obvious that the situation like this can happen. But now that's really interesting. Russia, we have different numbers, but they are significant, what they can get for their economy. It is the short term, but long term consequences may be quite difficult, both for the possible spring counteroffensive, for the Russian supply for the future, for the stabilization of the economy. And everybody hoped that by summer they would have a significant economic crisis that can make them more eager to negotiate. But what is really the most important, and that is both decision for Russia and for Iran with lifting the sanctions. What does mean the sanctions regime? If so easily it can be just lifted when you're making your own mistakes.
Right. Another interesting thing is that two different theaters of war are actually starting to converge in a lot of aspects. So Ukraine's foreign commander-in-chief is arguing that this war is redefining global conflict. Are we already seeing its lesson applied in the Middle East?
Surely, look for the war. All the countries of the Gulf for the last 10 years have been buying a lot of weapons, predominantly from the United States. And most of these weapons, they were of the long-range missiles, very expensive air defense systems, plus the airplanes. And they absolutely been assured that with the U.S. bases at their territory, they're protected. What's happened that when we saw statistics of the first months of the war, yes, it is a good statistics for the interception of the missiles, but it is quite a bad statistics for the interception of drones. And as we know, for the last 3 years, the war in Ukraine been significantly the war of drones and of the new technologies and of everything happening there. Plus the factor that the U.S. base is a security, it's sort of guarantee, let's say, or something like additional factor for your security is also broke as the glass. So now we are looking with this particular situation that we can make a lot of the parallels with Ukraine, not of what lessons being learned, but which lessons the countries didn't want to learn and now learning in quite a painful way.
All right. Now, how do you think the development around Iran, especially involving energy and even potential ground operations, might actually feed back into the war in Ukraine?
First of all, we see the number of weapons that being used, and that means that Ukraine will have less opportunity to buy, first of all, air defense systems that we need. And Russia is continuing striking us daily. Right now, it is the alert here in Odessa. So Russians are not stopping, and we need not less, but even more air defense missiles and air defense systems. Considering that the production didn't increase as expected before, and we know how much money being spent from the U.S. budget, not for Ukraine, but for increasing the production in the U.S. Now, probably in a month or two, we can expect the significant shortage of all these systems. And in this way, that would be quite a dangerous situation for Ukraine.
Right. Thank you so much for helping us unpack all of this and help us connect the dots. Really appreciate it. And thanks for being with us on TVP World. And thank you for tuning into this edition of World Talks. But for more news, update, and commentary, please stay tuned to TVP World.